Of course we'll handle the bills, Mom. We don't want you getting confused and sending your pension to one of those Nigerian princes. My son Mark said this with a smile, but his eyes were hard. We were in my own kitchen, sitting at the little oak table my late husband, Frank, had refinished. The air smelled of brewing coffee and the lemon polish I used that morning. A hot flash of shame washed over me, so strong it felt like a fever. It was followed by something else, something cold and sharp. He wasn't just talking about bills, he was talking about my life. Mark patted my hand, the one holding my favorite blue ceramic mug. His touch felt heavy. "It's just easier this way," he said, already reaching for the stack of mail on my counter. "You've worked hard. It's time for you to relax." I watched him sort through my private letters and wondered when my son had started looking at me like a problem to be managed. Mark spread my mail across the table like a game of solitaire. He made two piles, one for junk, one for bills. His wife, Susan, sat beside him, sipping her coffee and watching me with a look of practiced pity. "See? Here's one from the electric company," Mark said, holding up an envelope. He placed it on the bill pile. "I paid that one online Tuesday," I said quietly. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Mark glanced at Susan and sighed. "She thinks she paid it," he said, as if I wasn't sitting 2 feet away. "It's better if we just double-check everything from now on." I didn't argue. I just sat there, remembering a boy of 17, begging me for a loan for his first car. He had promised to pay back every penny. He never did. He called it a gift later, laughing about it at a family dinner. I wondered if he even remembered signing the little IOU I still had tucked away. The phone rang the next afternoon. It was Susan. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the way it gets when she wants something. "Eleanor, dear, I was just calling to check in. Did you remember to take your blood pressure medication today?" "Yes, Susan. I took it with my breakfast, just like I have every day for the past 10 years, I said. I was looking out the window at my rose bushes. They needed watering. "Oh, good, good," she chirped. There was a pause. "You know, Mark and I were talking. To make things easier, we thought maybe you should consider giving us power of attorney, just for your finances. It would save you so much worry." The line went quiet. I saw my reflection in the dark screen of the television across the room. My hair was a mess. My face looked tired, etched with lines of worry. For a terrible second, I wondered if they were right. At the grocery store, I pushed my cart down the canned goods aisle. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Mark had insisted on driving me. When we got to the checkout, I pulled out my debit card. Mark gently took it from my hand. "Let me get this, Mom," he said loudly, for the cashier to hear. "These new chip and pin machines are just too complicated." My face burned. I've used a chip and pin machine 1,000 times. He paid, then slipped my card into his own wallet. "I'll hang on to this for safekeeping," he said with a wink. The automatic doors slid open, and a blast of hot parking lot air hit us. Back at my house, while he unloaded the bags, I held out my hand. "I'll take my card back now, Mark." He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I already gave it to you, Mom. In the car." But he hadn't. I knew he hadn't. After Mark and Susan left, a cold knot of panic tightened in my stomach. His jacket was still draped over the back of a dining room chair. My hand trembled as I reached into the inside pocket. There it was, my debit card, tucked next to his wallet. I was standing there, holding it, when he walked back in, having forgotten the jacket. He saw the card in my hand. He didn't look surprised. He just let out a long, weary sigh. "Oh, Mom," he said, his voice full of disappointment. Your memory is getting worse. You must have put it there yourself and forgot. He took the card from my fingers and placed it on the kitchen counter. See? This is what I'm talking about. This is why we need to help. For the first time, it wasn't anger I felt. It was real, chilling fear. He would lie right to my face and make me believe it was my own mind that was broken. My neighbour Carol stopped by for tea the next afternoon. The doorbell chimed its familiar little tune, a welcome sound after a day of silence. I poured us both a cup of Earl Grey, the steam warming my face. We sat at the kitchen table, the sun slanting through the blinds. You seem a little quiet today, Eleanor, she said, stirring a spoonful of sugar into her cup. The tiny clink of the spoon against the porcelain was loud in the room. I looked down at my hands, wrapped around the warm mug. Just some family things, Carol. You know how it is. She nodded slowly, her eyes kind but sharp. She'd known me for 20 years. I do, she said. My brother tried something similar with Mother after Dad passed. Said she was getting forgetful. He just wanted to get his hands on the house. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. She fought him, Carol said, her voice firm. She leaned forward, her hand covering mine for a moment. Her skin was cool and dry. Documentation is a quiet weapon, Eleanor. Remember that. After she left, I stood in the hallway for a long time, just looking at the old, dusty filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. Mark showed up 2 days later, and he wasn't alone. He brought a man with him, a stranger with a shiny suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The air conditioner hummed, pushing cold air into the living room. Mom, this is Dave, Mark said, gesturing to the man. A family friend. He's a financial advisor. Dave shook my hand. His was soft and damp. He sat on my good sofa and talked about making my life simpler. He used words like consolidate and manage trust. He said it would take all the worry off my shoulders. He pulled a thick sheaf of papers from his briefcase and spread them on the coffee table. We'd just put everything into one simple account, he explained, his voice smooth as oil. And Mark could handle the little details as your trustee. I looked at the signature line on the top page. It was already marked with a little yellow arrow sticker for me. I'll need to think about it, I said, my voice steady. When they finally left, the papers felt heavy and cold in my hands. An official-looking envelope arrived a week later. It came by certified mail, which meant I had to sign for it at the door. The mailman looked at me with pity in his eyes. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart thumping like a drum. My hands trembled as I tore it open with my letter opener, the one my late husband gave me. It was from the county courthouse, a petition for a competency hearing filed by my son, Mark Vance. The legal words swam before my eyes. It was pages of tiny, dense print. But I didn't need to read all of it. A few phrases jumped out, burning themselves into my mind. Cognitive decline. Unable to manage her own affairs. And the worst ones, right there in black and white. Mentally incapable. Mark drove me to the doctor's appointment he had scheduled. He said it was just a routine checkup. The waiting room smelled of rubbing alcohol and old magazines. I sat on a crinkly paper sheet in the examination room, my feet dangling above the floor like a child's. The doctor was a young man who called me Eleanor as if we were old friends. He didn't check my blood pressure. He didn't listen to my heart. He pulled up a stool and asked me to draw the face of a clock, with the hands pointing to 11:10. He asked me who the current president was. Joe Biden, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I drew the clock perfectly. Each question, each simple test, felt like a small, sharp stone being thrown at me. It was a deep, burning humiliation that made my cheeks hot. He just nodded and made a note on his clipboard. On the drive home, the familiar houses of my neighborhood blurred past the car window. Mark reached over and patted my hand, the way you would a frightened dog. The touch felt wrong. I pulled my hand away and folded it in my lap. "It's all for the best, Mom," he said, his voice soft and reasonable. "The judge will see you need help. We're protecting you from yourself." I didn't answer. I just stared out the window. I wasn't looking at the passing scenery anymore. I was looking at the next 10, maybe 20 years of my life, and wondering if any of them would truly belong to me. That night, I did not sleep. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than usual. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a countdown. I lay under my wedding quilt, the one my mother helped me stitch, and I stared at the shadows on the ceiling. Mark's words echoed in the quiet room. "We're protecting you from yourself." The condescending pat on my hand. I felt the heat of it still. Sometime around 3 in the morning, when the moon cast a sliver of light across the floorboards, I made a decision. I slipped out of bed, my feet cold on the wood floor. I didn't bother with a robe. I went to the hall closet and pulled the string for the attic stairs. They unfolded with a familiar groan. The air that drifted down was thick with the smell of old wood and mothballs. I climbed the steps, one hand on the rickety railing, and went to the far corner, past my late husband's army trunk and boxes of Christmas ornaments. There it was, a heavy, metal filing cabinet, painted a dull grey. It had been locked for 30 years. I reached up and touched the gold locket I always wore. My husband, Robert, had given it to me. Inside wasn't a picture of him or of Mark. It held a tiny, intricate key. With a click, I opened the clasp and took it out. The key felt cool and solid in my palm. It slid into the lock with a satisfying rasp of metal on metal. I turned it, and the top drawer popped open an inch. I pulled it all the way out. It glided smoothly on its old runners. The files were perfectly organized, with neat, typed labels. But I didn't need to look at those. On top of the files sat a thick, leather-bound ledger. The label on the front was written in my own clear hand. M.L. Marks Loans. I took the ledger downstairs to the kitchen table. The vinyl cover was cool to the touch. I opened it. Page after page of entries, all in the same neat script. April 12th, 1991, $5,000, first car, down payment. June 3rd, 1998, $15,000, college tuition, final semester. August 22, 2005, $2,500, security deposit, first apartment. Each entry had a date, an amount, and a purpose. Tucked into the back of the ledger were the notes he'd scribbled on scraps of paper. "I owe you one new transmission, love, Mark." "I owe you for the rent, Mum. You're a lifesaver." He had always laughed when he signed them, as if it were all a big family joke. It had never been a joke to me. The next morning, I found my old address book in the kitchen drawer, the one with the cracked cover. I flipped through the pages until I found the entry for my best friend, Martha, who passed away 5 years ago. Below her name was the number for her daughter, Chloe. I remembered Martha telling me with such pride that Chloe had passed the bar exam. I picked up the kitchen phone, the one with the long coiled cord, and dialed. Her voice was professional, a little distant. "This is Chloe Adams." "Chloe, dear, it's Eleanor Vance, your mother's old friend." "Mrs. Vance, of course. How are you?" Her voice warmed, but there was a careful note in it. The sound of someone talking to an elderly person they expect might be confused. I took a breath. "I'm fine, Chloe. I need to ask for your professional help. It's a family financial matter. There was a pause. A financial matter? She asked, her tone shifting to one of gentle concern. I could almost hear her thinking it. Poor old Eleanor. They said I was losing my mind, but all I had really lost was my patience. I knew she thought my son had a point. Chloe's office smelled like lemon polish and expensive paper. It was all glass and pale wood, nothing like the cozy clutter of my house. I sat in a stiff chair across from her big, empty desk. She smiled at me with a practiced, gentle expression, the kind you give a child or a stray cat. "Now, Mrs. Vance," she began, folding her hands. "What seems to be the trouble?" I didn't say a word. I just opened my large handbag, took out the thick envelope, and slid the court summons across the polished wood. She picked it up. I watched her eyes scan the legal language, her professional pity plain on her face. Her expression tightened. "Your own son filed this?" she asked, her voice hushed. "He believes I'm losing my marbles," I said, my voice steady. "He thinks I need to be protected from myself." I told her everything then. The unpaid bills he created, the debit card he took, the way he spoke about me as if I were a piece of furniture. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair, her face unreadable. "This is a serious accusation, Eleanor," she said quietly. "Do you have any proof you're financially competent?" For the first time in weeks, a real smile touched my lips, the kind that reached my eyes. I reached back into my handbag. "I believe so," I said. I pulled out a single, folded piece of paper and handed it to her. It wasn't a court document. It wasn't a letter from a doctor. It was a one-page summary from my brokerage account, printed that very morning at the public library. Chloe unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the top line, then moved down the page, then shot back up to the top. She put the paper down on her desk and stared at it. Then she looked at me, and for the first time, the look of pity was completely gone. In its place was something that looked a lot like shock. The total at the bottom of the page was well over $1 million, and right at the top, under Account Manager, was my name. Eleanor Vance. Chloe's jaw dropped. She picked up the summary sheet like it was a fragile, ancient document. Her eyes, which had been full of professional pity just moments before, were now wide with disbelief. The air in the office was still, broken only by the quiet hum of her computer. She spent the next hour looking over the detailed statements I had brought in a heavy accordion file. She spread them across her polished desk, page after page of trades, dividends, and growth charts. "Eleanor," she said, finally looking up at me. Her voice was different now. It was full of respect. "This is more than a defense. This is a weapon." A small, tight knot in my chest began to loosen. For the first time, I felt a flicker of real hope. They thought my life was a story they could finish writing for me. They forgot I was still holding the pen. Chloe nodded slowly, a real smile touching her lips. We started to form a plan. That night, I didn't sleep much, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness. It wasn't fueled by fear, but by a cold, clear energy. I sat at my late husband's old oak desk, the wood cool beneath my forearms. The only light came from the computer screen, casting a blue glow on my hands as I typed. I went to my online banking site first. The password was my anniversary date. I changed it to something complicated, a jumble of letters and numbers only I would know. Then I logged into my brokerage account. I did the same thing. For each account, I set up two-factor authentication. My little flip phone, which Mark always made fun of, buzzed with a security code. I typed it in. Another buzz. I typed that one in too. It felt like I was building a fortress around my life, one digital brick at a time. I was locking the doors Mark had always assumed were wide open for him. The call came 2 days later. I was in the living room, watching the local news and mending a seam on a dish towel. The phone rang, and I saw Mark's name on the little screen. I took a breath and answered. "Hello, Mark." His voice was tight with irritation. "Mom, the bank website is broken. It won't let me in to pay your electric bill." I could hear the impatience, the assumption that I was the problem, not the website. I kept my voice calm and even, like I was telling him the weather. "Don't worry, dear," I said, stitching a neat final knot in the towel. "I've handled it." The silence on his end of the line was deafening. The next morning, I put on my good coat and drove to the bank downtown. I'd known the manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, for years. I sat in the chair across from her desk, the one with the slightly worn leather arms. I explained that I needed notarized copies of every wire transfer I had ever sent to my son's account, going back 15 years. She didn't ask why. She just gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Of course, Eleanor. Let me get that started for you." I waited, listening to the quiet hum of the bank and the heavy thud of the notary stamp on each document. An hour later, I walked out with a thick envelope. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with proof. Mrs. Gable walked me to the door. "Good luck," she whispered, and I knew she meant it. That Thursday was my church knitting circle. We sat in the basement on folding chairs, the air smelling of coffee and Mrs. Henderson's lemon pound cake. The sound of clicking needles was a comforting rhythm. During a lull in the chatter, I sighed softly. "Oh, my Mark," I said, looking down at the grey yarn in my lap. "He's so worried about my finances. He's even taking me to court to make sure I'm being looked after properly." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't add any drama. I just dropped the stone into the pond and watched the ripples. The needles stopped clicking. Every woman in that circle looked at me. They exchanged glances that said more than 1,000 words. Helen, a retired clerk of court, caught my eye from across the circle. She gave me a single, subtle, encouraging nod before picking up her needles again. The social truth had been planted, and I knew it would grow. Chloe and I prepared. We didn't rehearse emotions, only facts. We sat in her office, which smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. The air conditioner hummed a steady, low note. "They will try to make you emotional, Eleanor," she said, tapping a pen on a yellow legal pad. "We will not give them that. We will give them numbers." She had me practice explaining my investment strategy. I talked about why I bought utility stocks for the dividends and tech stocks for growth. I explained it in simple terms, the way I would to my church knitting circle. I laid out my outfit on my bed that afternoon. A conservative navy blue dress, my sensible black shoes, and my late husband Arthur's gold watch. I fastened the cool, heavy links around my wrist. It felt like holding his hand. Was strength going to be enough? The night before the hearing, I was calm. I went out to my garden as the sun set, the air thick with the sweet scent of my roses. I watered each bush, my hands steady. The sound of the crickets starting their evening song was a comfort. Inside, I sat at my kitchen table and read through my ledger one last time. The pages were soft with age, but the ink was sharp and clear. Each loan, each date, each flimsy IOU was a tiny piece of the story. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. My phone buzzed on the table, its screen a bright rectangle in the dim light. It was a text from Susan. "Mark is only doing this because he loves you." I read the words, and a small, tired smile touched my lips. I turned the phone face down on the table. The silence in my kitchen was my answer. We arrived at the courthouse. I took the old wooden cane from the back seat of Chloe's car. I didn't really need it, but it helped paint the picture they had started. The courthouse steps looked steep and imposing. Mark and Susan rushed over as soon as they saw me, their faces a perfect performance of concern. "Mum, let us help you," Mark said, reaching for my arm. "The steps are so tricky." I looked right past him, past his outstretched hand. My eyes found Chloe, who was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps with her leather briefcase. I walked to her side. The tap, tap, tap of the cane on the concrete was the only sound between us. Every tap felt like a declaration. I was walking into their story, but I was going to write my own ending. Mark's lawyer painted a picture of a sweet, confused woman. The courtroom smelled of old wood and floor polish. He spoke in a smooth, oily voice about my decline, about a phone scam I supposedly almost fell for. He made it sound like I left the stove on every other day. Then Mark took the stand. He looked at me with such sorrow, his voice thick with fake emotion. He told the judge how worried he was, how I'd been forgetting things, like his birthday. I hadn't forgotten his birthday. I just hadn't called him. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded over my purse in my lap. My back was straight. I focused on the dust motes dancing in the long shafts of sunlight coming through the tall windows. He was describing a stranger, a feeble old woman I didn't know. I wondered if the judge believed him. The judge, a woman about 50 with sharp eyes and hair pulled back in a tight bun, turned to me. Her voice was clear and direct. "Mrs. Vance?" I met her gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." She asked me gentle questions about my daily life. "How long have you lived at your current address?" she asked. 42 years, Your Honor," I answered. "And you manage your own household shopping?" "Yes. I go to the Kroger every Tuesday and Friday morning." She asked about my health, my social security income. I answered each question calmly and directly, without adding any extra words. I didn't look at Mark or Susan. My attention was entirely on the woman who held my future in her hands. She listened, nodding slightly, her face giving nothing away. It felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for a storm to finally break. Chloe stood up. Her voice was calm and clear, cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom. The air smelled of old paper and furniture polish. "Your Honor," she said, "my client would like to address the court regarding her financial acumen." She walked to the judge's bench, her heels making a soft, confident click on the tile floor. She placed a thick black binder down with a solid thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. "This," Chloe announced, her voice steady, "is a summary of the stock portfolio Mrs. Eleanor Vance has managed herself for the past 32 years. A little murmur went through the room. I saw Mark lean forward, a confused frown on his face. He was looking at the binder as if he'd never seen such a thing in his life. He hadn't. The judge, a woman with tired eyes but a sharp mind, opened the binder. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as she turned the first page, then the second. Her eyebrows, which had been set in a line of professional patience, began to climb up her forehead. She looked from the pages to me, and then back to the pages again. She stopped at one page, tapping it with her pen. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice different now, full of genuine curiosity. "It says here you sold all your shares in a major tech company last May. That was a month before their stock dropped 20%. Why?" I took a breath. The air didn't feel so stale anymore. "Their quarterly earnings report showed slowing growth, Your Honor, and their debt-to-equity ratio was getting too high for my comfort." I kept my voice steady, just like I was explaining a recipe for my prize-winning apple pie. It seemed like a sensible time to take my profits. The judge put the binder down on her desk. She slowly took off her reading glasses. She didn't look at the binder. She didn't look at me. She looked directly at my son. "Mr. Vance?" she asked. The question hung in the air, cold and heavy. Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish pulled from the water. His lawyer started to stand, shuffling papers, but Chloe was already moving. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Chloe said, her voice ringing with authority, "we are filing a countersuit." She placed a second, thinner folder next to the first one. Inside was my old ledger, the pages worn soft with time. On top were the flimsy IOU notes, and beneath them, the crisp, notarized copies of the bank transfers. Each one was a quiet testament to the truth. For the recovery of $112,450 in undocumented, unpaid personal loans, Chloe stated clearly, plus interest. The colour drained from Mark's face. He looked pale, almost grey, under the fluorescent lights. Susan, sitting behind him, let out a tiny gasp, like a balloon losing its air. His lawyer just stared at the new folder on the judge's bench, as if it were a rattlesnake. The judge looked at Mark for a long, silent moment. I think in that moment, she saw everything. The greed, the disrespect, the slow, chipping away at an old woman's confidence. She picked up her gavel. "The petition for a competency hearing," she declared, her voice sharp as glass, "is dismissed with extreme prejudice." The gavel came down with a crack that made me jump. She then looked at Chloe. "The court accepts the filing for the countersuit. A hearing date will be set." It was over. Just like that, the world had tilted back onto its axis. Chloe gathered our papers and slid them back into her briefcase. The snaps clicked shut, a final, satisfying sound. I stood up, leaving the cane I'd leaned against my chair right where it was. I didn't need it. We walked toward the heavy double doors. Mark and Susan were still in their seats, frozen, as if the judge's words had turned them to stone. They didn't look at me as I passed. I pushed open the courtroom door myself. The hallway felt vast and quiet, and our footsteps echoed on the polished floor. When we stepped outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun hit my face. It felt warmer than it had in months, like it was reaching right into my bones. I took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air. I was free. The voicemails started that afternoon. The little red light on my answering machine was blinking furiously, like a tiny warning signal. I sat in my armchair, the one with the worn floral pattern, and pressed the play button. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between messages. First came Mark's voice, tight and loud, crackling through the small speaker. He wasn't sad. He was furious. He talked about loyalty and family, and how could I betray him? He said I had embarrassed him, that I had destroyed his life over a few dollars he was always going to pay back. Then came Susan. Her voice was thick with tears, a performance of wounded motherhood. She cried about their mortgage. She wailed about the children's college funds. "How could you do this to your own grandchildren, Eleanor?" she sobbed. I listened to each message once. I felt a little flutter of the old guilt, the one a mother always carries in a hidden pocket. But it was faint now. I heard the words, not as a plea, but as a tactic. When the last message ended, I reached out and pressed the delete button. The little red light went out. The only sound left was the quiet hum of my own home. The next morning, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with my phone. The sunlight streamed in, lighting up the little dust motes dancing in the air. I didn't want to spend my days deleting angry voicemails. I wanted peace. I called Chloe. Good morning, Eleanor, she said, her voice crisp and professional. Chloe, I need you to send a message for me, I told her, my voice steady. Just one sentence. I took a sip of my hot tea. It should say, all future communication must go through my legal counsel. I can do that right now, she said. After we hung up, I opened the contacts in my phone. My thumb hovered over Mark's name for a long moment. Then I pressed block contact. I did the same for Susan. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt like turning off a faucet that had been dripping for 30 years. The silence that followed was a brand new sound. A few days later, I was back in Chloe's office. This time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a client. She had brought in a financial planner, a sharp young woman named Sarah, who smelled faintly of coffee and competence. She didn't talk down to me. She asked about my risk tolerance and my goals for the next 20 years. We spent 2 hours drawing up a formal trust. It felt like building a stone wall around my life, one that no one could tear down. Chloe looked up from her papers, her pen poised. Who would you like to name as your executor, Eleanor? And the successor trustee, should anything happen to you? I didn't have to think about it. My neighbour Carol's daughter, Maria, I said. She's a CPA, a good, sensible woman. Chloe made a note. Then she asked the question that hung in the air. And your son, Mark. I looked out the window at the busy street below. I thought of a little boy with a scraped knee, of a teenager asking for car keys, of a grown man with his hand out. Mark will not be mentioned, I said. It was the quietest, heaviest sentence I had ever spoken. The first check from the court-ordered payments arrived in an envelope from Chloe's office. I set it on my hall table. It wasn't for a lot of money, but it felt heavier than any check I had ever held. I picked up the phone and called a locksmith. A polite young man arrived an hour later. Just want all the exterior locks changed, I told him, as he laid out his tools on a soft cloth. Moving in? He asked, trying to be friendly. Something like that, I said with a small smile. Starting fresh. When he was done, he handed me a set of 3 new keys. They were shiny and sharp in my palm. I closed the front door behind him and turned the new deadbolt. It made a solid, satisfying thunk that echoed in the quiet hall. I held the key in my hand. It was just a small piece of metal, but it felt like the key to everything. That evening, I sat down at the small desk in my bedroom, the one that looks out over my rose bushes. The air smelled sweet. I turned on my computer, the low hum of familiar comfort. I logged into my investment account and sold a small block of utility shares I'd owned for decades. The money appeared in my bank account almost instantly. Then I went to my bank's website and found the mortgage page. The remaining balance was small, something I'd just been letting run its course. I typed in the numbers and clicked Pay in Full. A week later, a thick, important-looking envelope arrived. I opened it right there in the kitchen. Inside was the deed to my house. I smoothed the heavy paper on the table. My name, Eleanor Vance, was printed in clear, dark ink. It was mine. Completely. The house didn't feel any different, but I did. I was sitting in the same chair, but I was no longer just a resident in my own life. I hired a company to install a new walk-in shower. The old tub had high walls, and for the last year, I'd been secretly afraid of slipping. I never told Mark. He would have used it as another piece of evidence, another reason I couldn't be trusted to live alone. 2 young men came, polite and clean. They laid drop cloths all over the hall carpet. The sound of drills and saws filled the house all day. It was the sound of progress. I sat in the living room with a book, breathing in the smell of fresh-cut wood and silicone cork. When they were finished, The head installer called me in. "What do you think, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool tile. I gripped the shiny chrome safety bar. It was solid as a rock. "I think it's perfect," I said. It was a small thing, but it was just for me, for my comfort, for my safety. It felt like the biggest luxury in the world. That night, the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, so I almost let it go to the machine. But something made me pick it up. "Hello? Grandma? It's Jessica." Her voice was small, hesitant. My son's daughter. We hadn't spoken in months. I felt my back stiffen. "Jessica, it's been a while." The silence on the line felt heavy, full of things unsaid. I I heard what happened," she finally stammered. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Mom and Dad, they said, can I come see you?" I didn't answer right away. I stood there in my quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and wondered if I could ever trust anyone in that family again. Jessica came over the next afternoon. She brought a bouquet of yellow tulips, my favorite, and stood awkwardly in the doorway until I invited her in. I put the flowers in a vase and set the kettle on the stove. We sat at the kitchen table, the way we used to when she was a little girl. She twisted a napkin in her hands. "They told me you were getting confused," she said, not looking at me. "They said you almost sent your social security check to a scammer. They swore they were just trying to protect you." I poured the hot water over the tea bags. "And you believed them?" It wasn't a question. Her head snapped up, and I saw tears in her eyes. "I didn't know what to believe," she whispered. "I should have called you. I should have just talked to you. I'm so, so sorry, Grandma." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a young woman, not a co-conspirator. I reached across the table and laid my hand over hers. Her skin was warm. It was a start. At my weekly knitting circle in the church basement, the air smelled of stale coffee and Mildred's lemon pound cake. The soft click-clack of needles was a comforting rhythm. I was working on a blue baby blanket, even though I didn't know anyone having a baby. I just liked the pattern. "Did you hear about the Vance house over on Oak Street?" said Margaret, who knew all the town gossip. "The big two-story with the porch swing? It just went on the market." My needles stopped for a half-second. That was Mark and Susan's house. "Oh my," Mildred said, her eyes wide. "With the market the way it is? I wonder what's wrong." I picked up my rhythm again, my eyes fixed on the yarn. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel anything like revenge. I just felt a quiet, heavy sense of balance. Consequences, I thought, are a debt that is always paid. That evening I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen lit up my face in the dim light. For years, I had dreamed of seeing the glaciers in Alaska. My husband and I had always planned to go, but we ran out of time. Mark always said it was too expensive, too cold, too much for me to handle alone. I found a website for a 2-week cruise. I looked at the pictures of the massive blue ice cliffs and the whales breaching in the cold water. I took out my credit card, the one Mark had tried to take from me, and typed the numbers into the little boxes. The confirmation page appeared. It was done. Then I picked up the phone and dialed. "Carol, it's Eleanor. I have a question for you." "Anything, dear," she said, her voice warm. "How do you feel about Alaska in July?" There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. Then, a joyful gasp. "Eleanor Vance!" she cried. "What have you gone and done?" Listening to her happy tears felt like winning all over again. I started a small, anonymous scholarship at the local high school. It wasn't a lot of money, just enough to help a young woman who wanted to study business or finance. I called it the Independence Scholarship. I met with the principal, a tired-looking man with a kind smile, in his office that smelled of floor wax and old paper. He looked over the paperwork I'd prepared. "This is very generous, Mrs. Vance." "It's just a little something," I said, smoothing my skirt. "I think it's important for a woman to know how to handle her own affairs." He nodded, his chair giving a little squeak. "We'll make sure it goes to a deserving student." Walking out of the school, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't felt before. It wasn't about getting even, it was about building something better. When I got home, there was an official-looking letter in my mailbox, the kind with a lawyer's name printed in the corner. My stomach gave a familiar, unwelcome lurch. My hands were steady as I opened the envelope with my silver letter opener. It was from Mark's lawyer. Inside was a settlement offer for the remainder of the loan. They were offering a lump sum, a check they could send tomorrow. I did the math in my head. The amount was 20% less than what the judge had ordered him to pay. They must have thought I was tired of the fight. They must have thought I'd take the easy money and just let it all be over. I sat there at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd told me I couldn't handle my own bills. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I picked up the phone and called Chloe. "I got an offer from Mark's lawyer," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I saw that," she said. "What are your thoughts, Eleanor?" The question hung in the air between us. I didn't have to think about it for long. "Chloe," I said, "please inform them that we are refusing the offer." There was a short pause on her end. "Are you sure? It would be over and done with." "I'm sure," I told her. I looked out the window at my rose bushes. The judgment was not a negotiation. That was all there was to say. After I hung up, a great weight lifted from my shoulders. A week later, a notification popped up on my phone. The full amount, down to the last penny, had been deposited into my account. The sound of that little chime was the quietest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I spent a few days just looking at the numbers in my bank account. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about what it represented. It was my freedom, bought and paid for. I sat at my computer for hours, the screen glowing in my dim living room, looking at pictures of little houses with screened-in porches and palm trees in the yard. I had always hated the cold, grey winters here. I called my neighbour Carol. "How do you feel about sunshine in January?" I asked her. "I feel very good about it, Eleanor," she laughed. "Why do you ask?" "Because I just bought a small condo in Florida," I said, "and I think you should be my first visitor." I was no longer tied to one place by fear or obligation. I was going where the sun was. The next Saturday, my granddaughter Jessica came over. We sat at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee between us. The steam warmed my hands. She'd been visiting more often, and the awkwardness between us was starting to fade, replaced by a comfortable quiet. She stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. "Grandma," she said, not quite meeting my eyes, "I was wondering, could you teach me?" "Teach you what, dear?" "About the stocks," she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were so earnest. "About investing. About how you did it all. I want to know how to be smart like you." I looked at her, my son's daughter, asking me to share the very knowledge he tried to take from me. I reached across the table and patted her hand. It felt better than any revenge. "Of course I can," I said. "Let's get a notebook." A few weeks later, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was messy and familiar. It was from Mark. I set it on the kitchen counter and let it sit there all day next to the salt shaker. That evening, I finally opened it with my silver letter opener. It was full of excuses, blaming his stress at work and Susan's anxieties. But buried in the third paragraph were the words I never thought I'd read. "I'm sorry." I read the letter twice. The hot anger I had carried for so long was gone. It had been replaced by a cool, quiet distance. I went up to the attic, the air smelling of old wood and dust. I didn't tear the letter up. I didn't burn it. I simply placed it inside an old shoebox filled with his childhood drawings and school reports. I put the lid on the box, closing a door I had no intention of ever opening again. The next Tuesday, I went to my first board meeting at the local senior centre. The director, a flustered woman named Brenda, was trying to make sense of a shoebox full of receipts. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Our last treasurer moved to Florida, and we're in a bit of a mess." "It's no trouble at all, Brenda," I told her. I spent the afternoon at a long folding table, the smell of stale coffee in the air, sorting everything into neat piles. By the time the 5 o'clock news started on the television in the common room, I had created a simple budget and found enough savings to fund the children's holiday gift drive. Brenda looked at the spreadsheet, her eyes wide. "This is wonderful. How did you do it?" I just smiled. It felt good to be useful. It felt even better to be respected. The phone rang on a Thursday morning while I was watering my African violets on the windowsill. It was Jessica. "Grandma, I did it. I bought 10 shares of that company you told me about." Her voice was buzzing with excitement. I could picture her in her small apartment, probably pacing by the window. We talked for a while about the market, about her job. Then, her voice got quiet. "I saw Dad yesterday," she said. "He was working a second job, delivering groceries." She paused. "He looked so tired, Grandma." A little flicker of something old and painful stirred in my chest, a mother's instinct, but it passed as quickly as it came. "Well," I said, my voice steady, "his choices are his own, dear. Now tell me what you're going to research next." I spent a week packing for my first winter away. My new condo in Florida was waiting. As I folded my sweaters, the scent of cedar rising from the chest, I looked around my house. It was the same floral wallpaper, the same grandfather clock ticking in the hall. But something was different. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a space that was entirely my own, filled only with my own rules and my own quiet thoughts. I zipped up my largest suitcase, a feeling of deep calm settling over me like a soft, warm blanket. The air in Alaska was so clean, it felt like a miracle. I sat on the balcony of our cruise ship, wrapped in a thick wool blanket Carol had knitted. She was dozing in the chair beside me, a little smile on her face. In the distance, a massive blue-white glacier rose out of the dark water. As I watched, a huge piece of ice cracked and broke away, crashing into the sea with a deep, echoing boom. It was a slow, quiet, unstoppable force. I lifted my cup of hot tea to my lips, the steam warming my face. The world was wide and full of wonders, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to see them all.